Hey guys, Nathan here again, back with another absurd being take on contributions to philosophy. Let's just quickly review what we've looked at so far. We've seen the resonating of being out of the plight. We saw how that led to the interplay, which was our transition from the first beginning to the other beginning, and the way that that was accomplished in the leap, which is what we looked at last time, that leap into being and truth, which Heidegger also described as throne projection, which was the way that Da-sein always finds itself already in a world. And he also describes it as casting loose from beings into being. So that leap into kind of the truth out of the realm of objective presence. And today we are looking at the grounding, moving on to the grounding, which will involve a lot of... But today actually we're just going to talk about Da-sein. In the next video, the second part of this one, still in the grounding, we'll look at language, truth, and time and space. But today, just Da-sein. So the grounding, let's get into it. What is... so the grounding is... the main feature of the grounding is Da-sein. So we're going to explore what Da-sein is for Heidegger here. So first thing to start off with is a definition. And I'll let Heidegger take over here. So he says, Da-sein is the one who grounds and preserves the truth of being, the there as the ground required by the very essence of being care. So that's a pretty decent quote, and I chose it because it kind of it brings together a number of different elements which go into Da-sein. So we can break it down. The way I've broken it down is I've taken 6 features from that quote, and we'll look at them in turn. So first, Da-sein is the one who grounds and preserves the truth of being. So first we've got this idea of grounding the truth of being. So here is the idea that Da-sein's the site, and that, remember, that word has come up before, the site of the moment of the turning for the clearing of beings in the appropriation, and the sheltering of the unconcealment of beings. So Da-sein is where being kind of occurs, being with a Y, where that event, the event of being, where that takes place. And it's where beings are cleared in the first place, the clearing of beings. And she, Da-sein, shelters the unconcealment of being. So these are all kind of poetic ways of describing Da-sein's role, the centrality of Da-sein's role in the event, in being. So we've got the idea that Da-sein grounds the truth of being. It's where beings appear, where beings are unconcealed. Secondly, we've got this idea of Da-sein preserving the truth of being as care. And again, these are kind of metaphorical descriptions in a way. Da-sein preserves the truth of being. But I think it gives a good sense, or when I read it anyway, it seems like it gives a good sense of how exactly Da-sein is being appropriated by being, how Da-sein is kind of implicated in this whole idea of the event. So preserves the truth of being as care. To care here means to be a preserver or steward of being with a Y, of course. So in a sense, the way to think about this, I think, is care as in caretaking. Da-sein is not caring as in the way that you care for someone you like, or the way that you care for something you value. It's more like caretaking, stewarding, that back to that idea of preserving. So that's how Da-sein preserves the truth of being here, as care. And in a way we can contrast this a little bit with the more practical connotations that care had in being in time. Being in time, care was really described as it was the being of Da-sein, but it was described in a very practical way, as in the utilization of things as tools, and that referential totality, significance, relevance, all that stuff. And here it's kind of more foundational. It's less, Heidegger's talking about preserving the truth of being as care, less about Da-sein interacting with the world and using beings or encountering beings, and more about the way, the more foundational way that Dasein, role in that foundational way that beings come to be as beings in the first place, in conjunction with the event of being. So we've got this idea: Da-sein grounds and preserves the truth of being. And Heidegger also talks about, in that quote, he talks about the there as the ground. So the there is worth having a look at also. So Dasein's the there, what does that mean? Well, in the first beginning, there means something like presence, to be here. Or as Heidegger puts it, to occur essentially there, by emerging out of itself as unconcealed. So it's a more, I guess, literal understanding of what there means as presence. In the other beginning, though, I'll quote it here: there is the openness of beings as such and as a whole, the ground of the more originally conceived aletheia. Aletheia means unconcealedness, by the way. To be does not simply mean to turn up, rather it signifies steadfast enduring as grounding the there. The there does not refer to some determinable here or yonder, it means the clearing of being itself. Okay, so that's pretty clear. I think the there doesn't mean here or there, it doesn't mean presence or appearing, but rather it's an opening up of the space in which here and there first come to have any kind of meaning. So it's deeper than that, the understanding of there in the first beginning. And that that opening up of that space, again, has to be understood metaphorically. Everything here has to be understood metaphorically, because there's no other way to understand the things that Heidegger's talking about. We're operating before language and words and the words that we use, before these things have any kind of meaning. So you really have to have kind of ridden through this terrain with Heidegger for these things to kind of make sense. And that's what I mean when I said a long time ago in one of these videos that sometimes when I talk about it, I feel like it makes sense to me, I think. But I think if you were just coming to this video kind of without the background, without having really gone into it, it does sound a little bit like just gibberish, the clearing of being, this idea of opening up and this space. What does that mean? But but yeah, it's really metaphorical, poetic language in a way. But that's the only way to talk about this stuff if we're talking about the root of being, how it is that beings appear as beings. There's no other way to get there. You have to use. Now we really come up against the limits of language, and So yeah, hopefully that kind of makes sense anyway. So that's what Da-sein as the there means here in the other beginning. It's not a there as in a presencing, but it's a there as in that clearing of being, that opening up of the space so that here and there first makes sense. So the fourth thing I've got is Da-sein is the one. Remember that quote, the one who grounds and preserves the truth of being. So this idea of the one, what does that mean? We can delve into this a little bit as well. So being in time treats Da-sein essentially as a human being, an individual. And if you come away from having read being in time, essentially thinking that those are those are synonyms, you could be forgiven for doing that, because that's basically the way Heidegger treats Da-sein in there. But it's not the way to understand Da-sein. Another thing that Heidegger says in Contributions is Da-sein is a way to be. And that sounds like it's a characteristic. It's something that it's a feature of the human being. But that's also wrong. That's also a mistaken or misleading way to put it. And the reason is that, again, characteristics are aspects of beings that already exist. Da-sein isn't a thing. Da-sein isn't a being to which we can ascribe characteristics or attributes the way that we can with objectively present things. Remember, Da-sein is the sight through which beings and characteristics therefore exist. The sight through which beings and those things like characteristics, attributes, through which those things come to existence in the first place. So to describe Da-sein as a being or as a characteristic has already put the cart before the horse. So what is Da-sein then? What is this idea of Da-sein being the one? Ultimately, I think Da-sein is a human being. There's no doubt about that, or a conscious being anyway. But it's not just any human being. It's not just a human being. It's more like, the way I've described it is more like a mode of being of a human who has fundamentally altered his or her relation to the world and experiences it authentically as the site for the opening of the truth of being. So it's more like everybody's not Da-sein just by virtue of being human. To reach Da-sein is like to have accomplished something. It's to come to this understanding of oneself as the site of the clearing of being, or the site of the opening of the truth of being. And again, I should just point out, authentic doesn't mean moral, or doesn't have any kind of any connotations like that. Anything to do with real or genuine. There's nothing. None of those kind of associations come with authentic. It just means it has to be understood in terms of being with a Y. So it just means that authentic, that grasp of oneself in light of, or in terms of being. Having cast oneself loose from beings and made that leap into being. That's where we are here. So fifth, the quote, just go back to it quickly, the there as the ground required by the very essence of being. So we can have a look at this idea, Da-sein being required by being. And this is interesting, and we have talked about this before, but Da-sein is not the subject of the action, is not the doer of the action. And throughout this whole video, I've talked about Da-sein grounding, preserving, sheltering, all those kind of things. But in actual fact, Da-sein is more passive, maybe, is one way to describe it. Da-sein is being appropriated. Remember that there's that element to Da-sein. And Heidegger says, right, that there is appropriated by being itself. The human being, as steward of the truth of being, is subsequently appropriated, and as belonging to Da-sein, is appropriated in a preeminent and unique way. So that Da-sein is not doing so much as is being done by or being done to. So being is the active force here, and it's, in a way, being is kind of taking place through Da-sein. So it's a fine line to kind of walk between this idea of being as something that happens, but something like an agent, like a conscious agent. And I don't think Heidegger wants to go that far. Being's not aware of itself; it's not consciously doing something to enact the event, and yet it is the active part of the event, as opposed to Da-sein. We typically think of humans as being the doers of events, right? Because we're conscious, we're aware of what's going on, we're the only thing really capable of doing anything. We are the only agents that we know of. But again, Heidegger wants to drill deeper, because ultimately there must be something going on prior to us in order that things come about, including ourselves. So again, we're just going to that extra step, extra level beneath ourselves. We're trying to look at how everything comes to be, how beings come to be as beings, and it can't. The bottom rung here can't be human beings, because how do you get to human beings in the first place? So being has this strange role of the doer, in a sense, and yet it's not a conscious doer in the way that we typically think of ourselves as agents. So anyway, Da-sein's required by being, so being appropriates Da-sein. And yeah. The other thing to note here is this is where Heidegger's idea of thrownness comes in too. So remember, thrownness is that idea where already, as soon as we're aware of it, we're already in a world. So again, there's that. This is again what I mean. Heidegger wants to go beneath that. This fact, this recognition that we are thrown, we have been thrown, indicates that something's going on beneath. Something happened before us, because we were thrown. We as soon as we come to be, we're already in a world. So something's happened prior to that, and that's what ultimately Heidegger's describing with being. So stop. I've got to stop going on about that. And finally, the last thing I have here to note is this idea of Da-sein is the site of the truth of being. Da-sein as the between. Heidegger talks about the between a lot. And my quote here is, Da-sein reveals itself as the between, which is developed by being itself, so as to become the open domain for beings that protrude into it. And again, it's more kind of poetic, metaphorical language, but if you take it on board and try not to think analytically, try not to think in terms of logic, in terms of reason, then you can kind of get a sense of what he's angling at. Da-sein is the between, it's the sight which is developed by being, so it can become the open domain for beings. And again, it's metaphorical, but you can kind of get a picture of being as the event, beings as the things around us, the things in the world, and Da-sein's kind of that link, the between, connecting them. And Heidegger talks about Da-sein being between humans as grounding of history and the gods in their history. And we'll talk about gods later, but there's that idea between. He also talks about Da-sein being between in relation to earth and world, the center of their strife. And if you remember in an earlier video, I forget which one it was, it was on the origin of the work of art. We talked a lot about strife and the way Da-sein is between world and earth, and that again comes up here. And he also talks about Da-sein being between being and beings, which was in that quote we had. So again, all these different ways of describing Da-sein, characterizing Da-sein, but the takeaway, I think, is that Da-sein it's not human being, and it's not just conscious beings. It's a more foundational, more fundamental role that Heidegger sees Da-sein playing, and yet not an active one as a conscious agent. So I've just got this short summary recapping what we've looked at. Da-sein is those 6 points: the one who grounds the truth of being as sight and shelters the unconcealment of beings. Da-sein, the one who preserves the truth of being as care. Da-sein is the there, or that which opens up space by sheltering and preserving, opening up space in which beings can appear as beings in the first place, opening up space in which there and here first acquire meaning. Da-sein is the one, which is that mode of being of the authentic human. So not just equivalent with human being. Fifth, Da-sein is required by being, appropriated, so thrown, and by extension not the thrower. And also Da-sein is sight, as the between humans and gods, earth and world, being and beings. Okay, so there are a few more things to talk about here. Just to bring this to a close, this section on Da-sein. So he talks about the ordinary way of being human, which is not Da-sein. And this he describes it in a quite nice way, I think, as a being away. So that takes us back to that idea of the forgottenness of being. Or another good quote of Heidegger's: this forgottenness of being is where we are infatuated with things, smitten with them, lost in them. So we're bustling about with objectively present things. We've forgotten being, and when we forget being, beings no longer appear as the beings that they are. They become. We interpret them. We see them. We understand them as typically as things we can use. They become kind of economic. They become things that that we think of them in terms of machination. Just they lose their essence, and so that Heidegger's the new way, the new word the new term he uses here, being away. I quite like that, being away. But he's also clear that this being away is still conceived on the basis of and still belongs to the there. So we still, the there is still Da-sein as the site. Da-sein as the site of the clearing of being is still primordial. It's still foundational, because if that weren't the case, there would be no beings for us to be infatuated with, for us to be smitten by. So Da-sein's still kind of in effect. It has to be. It's just that we've forgotten that. We've lost sight of that. So Da-sein must always already be preserving being. It's just that, and the way Heidegger describes it, being away isn't not being there. It isn't not Da-sein. Rather, it's a forgottenness of being there. It's a forgottenness of Da-sein. And this forgottenness is what Heidegger describes as inauthenticity. So there's that nice parallel. Inauthenticity is that forgottenness, authenticity, Da-sein, that authentic Da-sein is remembering, bringing ourselves back into the fold of being and seeing beings as they are through that lens. Another thing is being toward death, which we looked at a lot in Being and Time, and it was central to Heidegger's discussion about authenticity. And in Contributions, he's a little bit defensive actually, and I guess he must have taken some heat for this idea of being toward death. And apparently the criticism was that this is kind of nihilistic, or a being toward nothingness. And so he comes out saying that's totally not what he was getting at. And if you got that idea, you got that impression from Being in Time, you've gone way off base. And that's so true, right? I mean, if you read Being in Time, if you read it properly, there's no way you can interpret being toward death as nihilistic or some kind of macabre obsession with death. So to the extent that he was seen in that way, that's a serious misreading of Heidegger for sure. Anyway, so he comes to his own defense, and says being toward death is Da-sein's most extreme possibility. The possibility of the impossibility of being of Da-sein. As a possibility of Da-sein's, death is therefore something that Da-sein is necessarily, intrinsically moving towards. Because remember I just wrote an article where I talked about this a little bit, so it's kind of fresh. But remember, death is a possibility of Da-sein's, but it's not a possibility like other possibilities. It's a guaranteed possibility. It's going to happen at some point, and it's not contingent in any way. It's necessary. So it's kind of built into what it means to be Da-sein, which brings it to that level, that existential level. So it's part of what it is. It's part of what it means to be Da-sein. And because it's at that deeper level than our other, in a way then, by comparison, more superficial possibilities, it's inevitable, although we don't know when it's going to happen. So being intrinsic to Da-sein, as being a part of what it means to be Da-sein, or to be a human being in this case, then Da-sein can only fully become itself, can only fully embrace its being if it embraces death. And that's what Heidegger was getting at. This is not some macabre nihilism or obsession with dying or nothingness. It's just death is part of what it means to be Da-sein. So to fully become Da-sein, we have to fully embrace and accept death and realize that we are progressing towards that. It's a guaranteed possibility. It's a possibility not in the sense that it might happen, it's a possibility in the sense that it's something we're projecting towards. But unlike other possibilities, we can't avoid it. It's a guaranteed possibility. And so we have to accept it. And Heidegger's just defending himself from that misreading of being in time. It doesn't really add anything, I think, to that idea in contributions. Another thing, the second to last thing actually, is Heidegger talks about who are humans? What is selfness? And this is interesting, actually. So I've got a quote to start us off. The self is not a property of an objectively present human being, and only semblantly is the self given with I consciousness. Selfhood, as the essential occurrence of Da-sein, arises out of the origin of Da-sein. Appropriation is at once assignment and consignment. Inasmuch as Da-sein is assigned to itself as belonging to the event, Da-sein does come to itself, but never as if the self were already an objectively present item that simply had not previously been reached. So it's a long quote, but there's a lot of important stuff in there. And the essence of it, I think, is normally we think of the self as, or I think of the self as the subjective locus of experience. There's another philosopher, Dan Zahavi, he talks about the self as the minimal self, which is this. You can strip away all these superfluous notions that we add onto the self as maybe like an enduring thing or something with certain qualities, or some kind of fixed nature within us. You can strip away all of those things and you're still left with something, and we call that self. And he calls it minimal self, and it's that subjective idea, or it's that subjective experiencer behind the experience. You can't have an experience without the experiencer. So usually that's what we think of the self as, the subjective locus of experience, the I who experiences. But for Heidegger, this I is first and foremost lost in the fallen, inauthentic forgottenness of being away. Or as in Being in Time, the way that Heidegger talked about it in Being in Time, this would be the they self. That self lost in das Man, the they. So selfhood for Heidegger then is actually authentic and therefore concerned with being. So it's not something that everybody is. It's not something that you get for free, as it were, just by being a human. It's something you have to earn, in a sense. And I've got another quote to that effect. Seeking an answer to the question of being is what brings the seekers to themselves for the first time, i.e. brings them into the selfhood of Da-sein, wherein the clearing and concealment of beings occur. Being a self is the finding that already lies in the seeking. So the two things to note from that little quote. First, human beings aren't automatically selves. You don't get to be a self just by being a human, just by being born. You have to earn it through inquiring into being and truth. It's that it's bound up with authenticity for Heidegger. It's bound up with being. It's bound up with Da-sein. Right? Remember, we also talked about that when I described Da-sein as the one. It's not, you aren't Da-sein just by being a human. Da-sein is comes with that recognition of oneself as the site for the clearing of being. And Heidegger's equating that with being a self. You don't get to be a self for free. To be a self requires some work. And the second thing which is interesting from that is that last line from that quote, being a self is the finding that already lies in the seeking. That's interesting because what it means there is the act of seeking is sufficient to become a self. You don't actually need to find anything. You don't have to, it's not something you achieve. Being a self means inquiring into being. Just that inquiry, that act of inquiring bestows, if I can use that word, bestows selfhood on you. So I thought that was interesting. And the very last thing is that I wanted to talk about here is the relation between Da-sein and being, being with a Y. So in Being and Time, Da-sein was still too subjectivistic. That's the word Heidegger used. I'm not even sure if that's a real word, but it was still too, like I said, it was too easy to think of Da-sein as just being human, just being caught up in consciousness or experience and experiencing being. And this can lead to the mistaken impression that Da-sein is the subject and being is the object. And so when we're thinking about being, what we're doing is we've got this idea of being as an object which we are the subject to. Sorry. So being, we're stuck on that level of subject-object, which again, Heidegger wants to get beneath. Before there could have been an object, we want to know what it was that made it possible for there to be objects in the first place. So my quote here, Da-sein, however, has overcome all subjectivity, and being is never an object, something we set over and against ourselves, something representable. And that's, again, just like I said, being is beneath that distinction between subject-object. And if you think about being in terms of being, if you think about Da-sein in terms of being in time, you can get that impression, and very much did get that impression from Being in Time. But in a way, it was understandable because that was what Heidegger was talking about. He was talking about the being of humans, the being of human beings, as opposed to being itself. And that's really the difference I see between Being in Time and his post Being in Time work. Being in Time was very much, well, that's what made it existential, right? The focus on the being of humans, and that was really the meat of that book. And the stuff about temporality, the authenticity and being toward death, resoluteness, that was also valuable, but it's still caught up in that focus on human beings as individual subjects. The temporality stuff, I think, is kind of a dead end a little bit for Heidegger, and the post Being in Time stuff, though, we've turned away from focusing on human beings and what it means to be a human being, and we're looking beneath that now. And so that's where we've come to. So let me just quickly summarize this. We've got those 6 features of Da-sein that we looked at, and I added 4 more things related to Da-sein. First, that ordinary way of being away, the forgottenness of being there, being toward death, Da-sein's ultimate possibility, nothing macabre or nihilistic about that. Selfness, which is earned in seeking the answer to the question of being. We aren't all selves automatically. And finally, our relation to being, not that of subject and object. It's prior to objects arising in the first place. And so that's Da-sein. That's the first part of this of this chapter, the grounding. Next video we'll look at language, truth, and time and space. So until then, thanks for listening, and I hope you like the new format. I'm gonna keep that, by the way, the diagram at the beginning, just to give us some context, and then the quotes as well. I'm gonna keep doing that. I think it's better than just being pure audio. So anyway, hopefully that is all good, and I'll see you shortly.